The producer and the consumer surplus will be our final subtopic in this regard, okay? Consumer and the producer surplus. Well, before I start explaining about this consumer and the producer surplus, this is a very, very interesting concept, and you better pay attention so that you may understand the two concepts, the producer and the consumer surpluses. Producer and the consumer surplus. They are simple to understand, but they are very interesting, okay? So when we talk of the producer surplus, I am going to define the concept by giving an example, so that you can understand it. So I will start by explaining the idea of the producer surplus. So assume that, for example, today you go to the market to buy, let's say to buy, for example, a mobile phone. Say for example, Redmi, for example. You want to buy, let's say, Redmi, let's say Note 8, for example. You are going to the market to buy Redmi Note 8, which is a very good phone. Okay. So when you go to the market, you go there with your expectations, or maybe you go there to the market when you are ignorant about the price. Okay. And the producers, they have also set the price to sell this particular item, this particular phone. So for example, the producers, they are very aware that the price of this phone, for example, is 600 Tanzanian shilling. T shilling, for example, 600,000. This is the price for the phone. But for them to get a supernormal profit, or for them to get a surplus, they will tend to add a price margin. Let's say they will start selling it at, let's say, 680, for example. Let's take this as an example. At 680, they expect that this the price for the phone is 600,000, but they have quoted it at 680. So if a consumer goes to the market, okay, and buys this kind of phone at this specific price, it means the producer, in this case the seller will have gained 80,000 out of this phone. Okay, this may be a huge amount, but we are using it as an example. Okay, he will have gained 80,000 Tanzanian shilling. He was expecting to sell the phone at 600, but he has sold it at 680. So this extra amount is the surplus. Okay. So by definition, a producer surplus is the amount that the producer or the seller is willing and able to sell minus the amount that he actually sells the products. Okay, so in this case, the producer surplus will be equal to 680,000 minus the 600,000 that this person intends to sell the product at. Then the difference is 80,000, which is the producer surplus. So the amount that the producer is willing and able to sell the product less the amount that he actually sells the product, in this case 80,000. So it can be due to the ignorance of the consumer. You go to the market when you are not aware of the product. You have to do your research. You do your research properly, understand the different price tags of the different phone brands, so that you may be able to maximize profit, because the opposite of producer surplus is the consumer surplus. But here we are done with it is just a simple example and a simple scenario of how producers gain their surplus. Of course, there are some calculations related to this, but in this case, I'm not going to go deep to the calculations. But this is just a simple scenario to explain the producer surplus. Okay, now the vice versa is the consumer surplus. Okay, the consumer surplus. And of course, this can be due to bargaining. Maybe you don't know how to bargain. You bargain, but this person he bargains better than you, and he wins. Then he gets the surplus. The vice versa is the consumer surplus. Now, in this regard, consumer surplus, I'm going to use the same scenario to talk about consumer surplus. This is just an abbreviation for consumer surplus, CS, consumer surplus. So for example, you go to the market. I'm going to use the same Redmi Note 8 phone. You go to the market. When you are expecting that this phone, maybe you have seen someone having it, you have seen the qualities, and maybe you think that the phone is so expensive. Maybe you have not done your research. So you go there expecting to buy the phone, let's say 650. Okay, 650. But when you reach to the market, you find that the price is let's say 550. It can be the actual price, or you may have bargained. But the implication here is that the price that you expected to buy the phone at is less than the price that you actually find in the market. So for example, in this case, you see that the price that you expected to buy the phone is higher than the price that you actually pay for the phone. So the difference between these two is what we call the consumer surplus. In this case, you will take the difference between 650, take the difference between 650, you less 550. What is the difference? The difference in this case is 100,000. So you find that you have saved 100 Tanzanian shilling, and we call this one the consumer surplus. Okay, so that's why you have to make your research. Just do your research, make the market survey, visit different marketplaces, just visit the different brands, so that you can maximize your welfare. You can maximize your surplus. Otherwise, it will be the vice versa. The producer will maximize his or her welfare maybe due to your ignorance or due to your poor knowledge about the brands. So these are the two concepts: the producer and the consumer surplus. The difference between the amount that a producer is willing and able to sell the product minus the amount that he actually sells the product is the producer surplus. And the difference between the amount that the consumer is willing and able to pay for the product minus the price that he actually pays for the product is the consumer surplus. So that is just an explanation, but as I said, there are some calculations on the same. You can calculate to understand how much. Okay, this was just a simple narration, but there are some other mathematical procedures to arrive at the surplus. Let me now draw. So let me draw the graph for producer and the consumer surplus so that the concept can be clearly understood. I am going to use the normal demand and supply curves, but in this case we are also going to use the equilibrium price. Equilibrium price is the price where both producers and the consumers agree. It is the market price. Okay, so let me draw the graph. Well, I'm just drawing the normal supply and the demand curve, but when I'm drawing this, I am also observing the laws of demand. I mean the law of supply and the law of demand. So okay, how do we draw this? We have a supply curve moving upward from left to right. This is supply, and we also have a demand curve sloping downward. This is demand and this one is demand. So do not forget to label. I have labeled demand, I have labeled supply, but I have not labeled in this on the vertical axis we have price, and on the horizontal axis we have the quantity demanded and the quantity supplied. Remember, in this case we have two curves. We have the curve for supply and we have the curve for demand. So the quantities on the horizontal axis will represent the quantities for the quantity supplied and the quantity demanded, and this will be the price of the commodity. Say for example, in our case we are talking about Redmi Note 8. So this is our product, and we are considering a consumer who has gone to the market to purchase this product, and we are expecting to meet a seller in the market who is selling that product. So there should be a leading price. So that is our equilibrium price. So as I said, equilibrium price is the price where the quantity demanded is equal to the quantity supplied. This is the condition for the equilibrium price to exist. It is the condition for the equilibrium price to exist, that the quantity demanded must be equal to the quantity supplied. So you can see from this graph that at a place where the supply curve meets the demand curve is where we establish the equilibrium price. So for example, in our case, let us say the equilibrium price for Redmi Note 8 is Tanzanian shilling 600, for example. Tanzanian shilling 600. So this is Tanzanian shillings 600. This is the equilibrium price where consumers and sellers are willing to exchange this kind of product. So from that we can now establish the quantity. For example, maybe is having one. This is one phone. Is buying one phone at that price. But the idea behind here is to show you the producer and the consumer surplus. Remember, the producer is affected by the supply curve. Okay, the producer is affected by the supply curve, and the consumer is affected by the demand, is represented by the demand curve, while the supplier or the seller is represented by the supply curve. So the consumer surplus is the entire area below the demand curve, and the producer surplus is the entire area above the supply curve. But let us go back to our scenario that, for example, the price here can be 680,000 here at that point, and maybe it can go as below. Okay, let us try to change this curve to make it a bit clear. Maybe it is crossing. It is not starting from 0, but it is rather crossing from that point. Okay, so for example here it is 650,000. But in our case, I just want to show you the area which indicates the producer surplus and the area which indicates the consumer surplus. So the area below the demand curve. Remember, this is the demand curve. So the area below the demand curve will represent the consumer surplus. This is consumer surplus, and the area which is below this, which is above, not below, the area which is above the supply curve. In this case, we have this area here. This area here is the area which represents the producer surplus. So when you are asked to make a distinction between the producer and the consumer surplus, you can briefly give that explanation, and you can use this illustration to explain the two concepts. As I said earlier, there are some calculations related to these concepts. As you see, we have the graph. The graph is having an area below the demand curve and an area above the supply curve. So there are some related calculations, but in this case I'm not going to go into details. Therefore, this is how you can simply define the concept that consumer surplus is the amount that the consumer is willing and able to pay minus the amount that he actually pays. In this case, 680,000 minus 600. So the surplus for the phone that he will make is the difference, 80,000. And the producer surplus is the amount that the producer or the seller is willing and able to sell the product minus the amount that he actually sells the product. So in this case, this person is willing to sell the product at 600. This is the equilibrium price, remember. Is willingly to sell the price at 600, but he actually sells it at 650, maybe due to the ignorance of the consumer and the many other factors. So the surplus that he makes out of that deal is the 50,000. Okay, so that is the difference between the producer and the consumer surplus. And with this illustration, you can now follow properly. You can get more explanations on other resources, on the other sources. But with this brief explanation, I hope you are able to distinguish between the producer and the consumer surplus. I welcome you again to the next videos that I will be explaining about other related economics-related concepts in the next videos. So don't forget to follow accordingly. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time.